So now then, well, very good afternoon, everybody. And today we come to the last of the present series of BRT UK lunchtime masterclasses supported by Atkins. Whether this is your first visit today or, as I can see on the screen, you've been with us since we started back in May, very warm welcome to you all, and thank you very much for joining us. We've got a rival in Boris Johnson at the moment, but even so, we are carrying on. After last week's fascinating update on Kent Fast Track with Shane Hymers and Daniel Gillan from Kent County Council, we're changing direction again this week, and I'm absolutely delighted that Robert Montgomery, one of the most experienced busmen in the business, is going to challenge our thinking a bit on the future of buses in Britain. His title today is Bus in the UK, Delivery in the Promised Land, Sharing the Spend and the Spoils. It's going to keep you awake, maybe at night at 2, but anyway, more about that and about Robert in a minute. As you'll have noticed, I have pressed the record button at the start, so we should be capturing the whole session for people to watch afterwards. And of course, for you audience, do please make sure that you are muted. This really is important because otherwise we can hear you whatever you're doing. Please stay muted during the whole session. And if you want to communicate, which I'm sure we very much hope that you will, please use the chat function to pose your questions and comments, and I'll put them to Robert in the Q&A session after his presentation. I'm James Freeman, and I'm Chair of Bus Rapid Transit UK, BRT UK we call it. I'm moderating today's session as I have been over the whole programme so far. BRT UK is about spreading knowledge and good practice in the field, not just of BRT itself, but of quality bus operations across the board. We're finishing our programme today by doing some wider thinking about the future, and we'll have done it by 13:30. You get rid of us quicker than you do of the Prime Minister. Passenger Transport is our media partner, writing up each of the sessions for the magazine. Do watch for next week's edition, which is out first thing next Thursday. And we gratefully acknowledge support from our advertising from Atkins. It's my very great pleasure now to introduce Robert to you. I first met Robert in 1983 in National Bus Company days, when I'd just taken over as manager of Shamrock and Rambler coaches at Bournemouth. Robert was at that time in charge of North Devon Limited, recently carved from the monolith Western National, and which he was in the process of revolutionising into Redbus. And I was sent to learn from him about how to get the best out of small companies within NBC. I did learn a lot. By that time, he'd already been in and around the bus industry for 13 years, making it now 52 years, Robert, since you started. He's held senior executive roles for the last 39 years in both public and private sectors, in both regulated and deregulated markets, not just in the UK, but in Ireland, Central Asia, North America, Western Europe, and the Middle East. He's also been involved in direct bus policy discussions in the UK with government on the 1985 Transport Act, back then, the 2000 Transport Scotland Act, and the 2017 Bus Services Act. He was Managing Director of Stagecoach Group's UK and European Bus and Coach Division 2013 to 2017, and during that time he was directly involved in the Tyne and Wear quality contract process, which was quite an event in itself. Since 2017, he's been director of busreinvented.com, involved in a series of business development and policy projects in both the Middle East and the UK, and he directly mobilized the largest greenfield urban bus startup in the world in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. He's a non-executive director and advisor to City Swift, supplying data analytics support to bus operators in the UK, North America, Europe, Middle East, and Asia. That sounds like most of the world. So he's marvelously well qualified to get us thinking about the future of the British bus industry. You may not agree with all he has to say, but you'll certainly be stimulated by what he says. So Robert, I think and hope that I have actually facilitated screen sharing for you already. And so it's over to you. And it looks like I have, so that's good. Robert.
Right, thank you, James. Just to start, I'll leave you with a slight disclaimer, which you might want to read to decide whether you'd rather participate in the rest of this webinar or listen to Boris.
We should play some music while that's going on. Maybe a funeral march or something like that.
I don't think so. Okay, let's move forward then. This slide isn't a belated part of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. It recognises the date and place on which I first entered the planet. I was born in Glasgow in 1952. And these pictures are pictures more of the street than of the vehicles. The city I grew up in the 1950s, if you wanted to go somewhere, you caught a bus or a trolley bus or a tram. Look at the streets, no real traffic to speak of. Traffic wasn't a thing in those days. The air quality wasn't brilliant for all sorts of other reasons, but it certainly wasn't due to traffic. And shortly after that, one of Boris's predecessors, Harold Macmillan, made a fairly important speech in which he told the people of Britain that they'd never had it so good. Wartime rationing was over, people were much more prosperous, and the man in the street could go out and buy his own motor car. And he could go on holiday to the Costa Brava. So the world began to change at that point. And boy, did we take advantage of it. From the early 50s right through to now, the volume of car use in the UK and across the whole world simply rocketed. And at the same time, levels of bus use fell. And those of you who know the industry well will know that the back end of that graph will look an awful lot worse if we took London out of it. So that's what happened, and that's where it left us. And it's appropriate that COP26 took place in Glasgow last year. That's the streets of Glasgow in 2019, immediately before the pandemic, congested, polluted, and overrun by cars. And that's a scene you would see in any city in the UK, and in many cases, any city in the world. So we're in a situation where those congested, polluted cities were part of a dying planet. We've learned from everything that's happened in the last few years that if anything is to be done to stop climate change, then one of the most important things is to reduce particularly urban traffic levels. They have to be seriously reduced. Otherwise, it's an existential issue for us all. And I feel sometimes that maybe we should all, on a Thursday afternoon, go and sit in a community centre somewhere in a big circle and say, I am Robert. I am an arsonist. I am burning my own home. That's where we are. We need to do something about it. And we've dealt with a lot of other social problems in my lifetime. In the 1950s, nobody thought twice about having a few beers and driving a car. The position on that has changed dramatically. None of us thought anything about being in smoke-filled pubs and smoke-filled rooms. Similarly, you used to find dog poo in the parks and in the streets. I could have illustrated that as well, but I thought that wouldn't make a very good picture. So really, the issue now is the next biggest social problem is dealing with traffic. We can't continue to live with high levels of traffic that are burning the planet, killing people, and damaging health. So we need to tackle that whole traffic issue and find ourselves in what I've called the promised land. Find ourselves back in cities where traffic isn't a thing, where you have clean, healthy air, no traffic congestion, street space devoted to walking, cycling, and zero emission mass transit, urban car parks repurposed, reduced deaths, improved health, and some chance of saving the planet for those who follow us. The kind of things we need to do, I think we all know what they are. Things like congestion charging, road pricing, improved vehicles, improved bus infrastructure, better bus priority, use technology to make mass transit accessible to people, develop mobility hubs, greater use of DRT, and say much better bus priority and much better street environment. So that's where I think we need to get to one way or another. So who can get us there? Do we rely on the guy on the left? Smart suit, nice tie, nice watch, tidy hair, very respectable. Or the guy on the right? Scruffy hairdo, unshaven, shirt buttoned down to his navel, and a black leather jacket. So is it the public sector or is it the private sector that can take us out of that and take us forward? Right now, the fashion is to assume it will be the public sector. It's quite fashionable now to refer to London-style franchising. All of the Metro mayors use that phrase constantly. Even the Secretary of State uses that phrase. And that quote in the top right-hand corner from Andrew Carter says, we'll look forward to the process continuing in order to deliver better, cheaper, more frequent bus services for the people. So the whole point, London-style franchising is associated with cheaper fares, more buses, higher frequencies. But who pays? So what I'd like to do first of all is just try and understand, what do we actually mean by London-style franchising? What does it do? Well, it's about giving powers to transport authorities to spend public money to reduce fares and increase service levels beyond what's financially sustainable in a commercial environment. And it's giving them powers to divert resources from areas of high bus demand to areas of low bus demand. Robin Hood in reverse. What you're doing is robbing buses from the poor to give them to the rich. The difference is that the poor use them, the rich don't. And powers to irretrievably replace a financially self-sustaining commercial bus network with one which will be dependent on ongoing public sector support. In London, for example, it currently requires about £700 million per annum to support what is called London-style franchising. There's no magic money tree involved in this. Franchising is about spending significant numbers of volumes of public money to improve bus services, reduce fares, increase frequencies, but do it in a way that is not financially sustainable. And there's a lesson in this. I mean, James referred to the fact that I was involved in the Nexus quality contract proposal back in 2013. And I remember reading the original proposal on a train in 2013, and it read wonderfully. There's all this motherhood and apple pie, everything would be wonderful, fares would be cheaper, service would be more frequent. And in fact, that original proposal also said it would be cheaper. It'd be cheaper to do it in the public sector than in the private sector. 2 years later, after forensic examination by economists and a lot of debate on the issue, and 2 weeks in the well-named Stadium of Light in Sunderland, the QCS Review Board came to the conclusion that it simply did not stack up. Even Nexus themselves admitted in the hearings that their own financial assessment, which was an optimistic one, had a 33% chance that the whole thing would end up in financial failure. So that's the reason that in the 2017 Bus Services Act, where mayors were given the power to franchise, they had a requirement to conduct an assessment of all the options and have the financial conclusions of that assessment independently audited before taking the drastic step of irrevocably destroying the commercial model. I was one of the people who pushed very, very hard with the DfT to ensure that that happened, purely because of the experience with Nexus. So now we have another franchising proposal from Manchester. Interestingly, the assessment conducted on Manchester in 2019 and the public consultation actually only assessed the impact of business as usual. It didn't make any provision for cheaper fares or increased frequencies. It made some provision for shuffling some buses from high traffic areas into low traffic areas, but it didn't make any major changes to the network itself. And that assessment showed it would cost £134 million to simply move from the existing model to a contracted model. What it didn't do was it didn't financially assess what's described in the consultation as phase two. Phase two involved reducing fares and increasing service levels. And that depends on substantial additional long-term public funding. I find it ironic that if you look at the Combined Authorities website, it says up front on the website that the franchising proposal will deliver cheaper fares and increase service levels. But those cheaper fares and increased service levels were never part of the consultation. They weren't assessed and they weren't financially assessed. And had they been assessed in that context, there'd have been a huge uplift in public sector expenditure. Interestingly, reductions in fares and increases in frequency are being introduced in parallel in the West Midlands with government funding through partnership without disrupting the commercial model. So franchising like London, which I describe as the autocratic option, the autocratic way of getting to the promised land, it's a command and control approach. It's very safe, it's very certain. If all of the bus operations is in the public sector and public sector can control it, they can determine what happens and where they get to. We're very low on innovation. It's not easy to make changes in a purely contracted environment, and there's not really much incentive to anyone to innovate. And it's bloody expensive, and it's funded at the whim of government, and therefore is a hostage to public expenditure cuts, as TfL. I find it ironic that the Secretary of State, who's reducing support to London for their bus network, is simultaneously encouraging Manchester to franchise, to move into the same world. Basically, I would have said that that version of development is one whose time is gone. It's environmentally credible. You can use that process to deal with the environmental issues, but it's not financially sustainable, particularly in the current public sector debt environment. So going down a route where we take the urban bus operations in the UK into being dependent on public money is a road to nowhere. Big question. Some people have said recently that the UK commercial bus model is broken. And I was asked that question very directly by someone a few weeks ago. And when you go away and think about it, my conclusion is it's not broken, it's a bit battered and bruised, partly by COVID, partly by Brexit. But actually, those are simply two bumps in the road. The real damage to the commercial bus model is the daily failure of highway authorities to manage urban roads and seriously address declining air quality and increasing congestion. If our traffic authorities decided to manage the roads to a proper capacity, restrained traffic to ensure that whatever traffic was there could flow freely, then that alone would deliver a benevolent bus operating environment and would trigger a significant transformation and modal shift and breathe life into the commercial bus model. What's holding buses back in our cities is not the operators, it's not COVID, it's not Brexit, it's the failure to manage the roads. We've seen developments on the parallel enhanced partnership option. The 2017 Act provided for enhanced partnerships. I think there's a lot of mileage in enhanced partnerships, but we haven't, pre-COVID, we only saw one from Hertfordshire County Council. That was made voluntarily before 2021. In many ways, it's a very attractive proposal. It does bring the operators and the authorities together in working to improve bus services. But the one thing it's silent on is car restraint. Given the part of the world it's in, I can understand why that's the case. But what it does do is make the best job you can with buses while the roads are still clogged with cars. More recently, we're seeing a lot more enhanced partnerships. But I don't actually see them as proper enhanced partnerships. They're more like shotgun marriages. They're not a route to the promised land because they don't actually address traffic congestion. They don't address air quality to the degree that's necessary. They're simply focused on bus service improvement plans as if buses were actually the problem. It's not the bus services that are the problem. It's the traffic on the streets that buses have to contend with that prevents buses performing the way they should. And therefore, the National Bus Strategy is too focused on buses and not sufficiently focused on mobility. I found an interesting quote from Mother Teresa, which might help us solve the conundrum. She said, "I can do things you cannot, you can do things I cannot, and together we can do great things." And I think if you take the guy on the left and the guy on the right, and you put them in the same room, and they sit down and put their cards on the table as to what they can each do, we can find a financially sustainable path to the promised land, sharing both the spend, the cost, and the benefits, the spoils. What I would see as the way forward is to move towards not bus partnerships, but mobility partnerships, dynamic urban mobility partnerships, a more democratic option. And they would have to begin from having very clear agreed objectives. We look back at my slide of the promised land. how do we get there? How do we get to traffic-free streets but maintaining mobility? We need to have a shared vision of how we reach that agreed objective. And you bring all the parties who are relevant into the one room to work on that. Those partnerships would be best independently chaired, not by the public sector, not necessarily by the private sector, but they need to be bodies which take account of compromise, discussion, debate, and find the talented way forward to the future. So they ought to be independently chaired, ideally by someone who has a reputation in the appropriate city. It might be a politician, might be a business person, might be an academic, could come from any kind of background, but someone who is capable of being the public face of a partnership which deals with urban mobility in the city, focused on being both environmental and financially sustainable, driven by car restraint and modal shift. Unless we address the car issue, unless we address the congestion, we will not solve the air quality problem, we won't solve the congestion problem, and we won't see mass transit working as it should. It can be funded by both public support and private investment, and ideally it should be funded by both. And it brings returns to the community for the public money and to the investors for the private money. And it can be done in a way that fosters ongoing innovation and challenge, not something that's ossified into a set of contracts that never change. Setting out to deliver a comprehensive, cooperative, coordinated mobility package for consumers in every city. This is a sample range of partners. Each city will be different. But what we need to do is to bring into the one room all of the important political bodies, the combined authority, the highway authorities, the police, transport focus, trade unions, chambers of commerce, all of those bodies, and everyone who contributes to mobility, whether that's bus operators, rail operators, tram operators, DRT, car clubs, electric scooters, tourist boards, and car park operators. We need that broadest church of people who have an interest in mobility in our big cities. Bring them together to work together, put their individual skills together to get the best results for the community. Governance would be fundamentally important. There are a lot of parties to this, and therefore there would be a very wide members forum. And we'd want everyone to have an opinion and have a view and have an input. But there would need to be a smaller steering group, effectively a mobility partnership board, which would take the big decisions. That would need to be supported democratically by a series of working parties. The ones on the right are the ones that would probably exist always. You could set up other ones for specific objectives and specific purposes. But it's a way of making sure that we get the talent and the contributions from the private sector and the public sector brought together. It will need an executive board and operational staff, because execution and delivery will be fundamental. And I would see that as being a legal entity with its own executive management team. If you take the Manchester example, instead of the franchising environment being executed by TFGM, it would be executed by a mobility partnership management, delivering coordination, delivering and managing capital projects, marketing and promoting the partnership brand and the mobility options, stimulating growth and change, and it would have its own budget. It would have money to spend. And the partnership would decide how to spend that money, and it would be allocated by the partnership board. In doing that, it should harness the legal powers of the public sector, the powers that the mayor has to deal with traffic, to deal with all of the other issues, would be executed by the mobility partnership. Similarly, the mobility partnership would benefit from delivery and consumer marketing skills of the private sector. So you bring everything together in that way, and that is how you take it forward. Funding is important. As I say, we're looking at something which would be financially sustainable. The approach to that, I would see as being, from a bus operator point of view, there should be a levy on all commercial operated gross revenues, 1% or 2%, not of profit, of total revenue. And therefore we'd be expecting bus operators to contribute, say, 2% of their revenue towards the funding of the partnership. That money would then be invested by the partnership in improving the mobility options in the city. And that is effectively, from an operator's point of view, investing short-term margin in long-term market growth. It's not unreasonable to invest 2% of revenue if it's invested wisely in terms of bus priority and other measures. That leads to modal shift, that leads to market growth, that leads to more profit. And therefore that 2% of revenue contribution could soon turn into 2 or 3% or 4% of margin growth. So it makes commercial sense to operators to do it, but they have to have the trust to hand them, to process the money through the partnership that they are party to. Similarly, the partnership will be funded by a levy on any urban car parking revenue, a workplace parking levy, and congestion charging, and also revenue funding from the combined authority and appropriate government grants. There may also be opportunities for operators to fund capital schemes which will make bus services better, whether that's infrastructure, bus priority measures, but they would be funded by the private sector based on a long-term revenue payback. So that's a summary of how I think there's a better way of getting to the promised land, more comprehensive way, more democratic way, and a more radical way. But it's much more likely to succeed in being financially and environmentally sustainable than going down the route of the 1990s approach of London-style franchising. I'll hand back to James at that point if there are any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert. You can see that Robert's been thinking about this very carefully and has come up with quite an interesting different way of approaching all this. And already the chat has some comments in it. So let's get on and take them as they come. So the first is from Roger French, well known to many people on this program today. He says, an absolutely first-class presentation, Robert, but haven't some of the private sector companies contributed to the perceived failings of the deregulated model by moving experienced managers away from their local areas and instead favouring more remote, centralised corporate control? This is a process which is sadly continuing even now in some groups, representing indeed a large proportion of the industry. Don't we need to give local managers proper autonomy so they can play an active role in the partnerships you described?
I saw Roger's note the other day about the recent or the proposed changes in First, and my view on those is very much one that we shouldn't become insular as an industry, and therefore I've been involved in buses for 50 odd years, and that has its advantages. Someone who's never seen a bus in their life coming into the industry brings advantages as well. So I think we've always got to keep a balance between those who know this business inside out and those who have experienced a wider world. But I do think that you do need to have more focused local operating companies because the comments I've made about in each city is different. And therefore you need to make sure that whoever is running buses in any of those cities understands it is part of the city, part of the community, not someone who's juggling 3 or 4 different operations 20, 30 miles apart. So to that extent, I would agree. I think the critical point in this, though, is we're in danger of drifting back to the problem of saying this is all the bus operator's fault. Whereas I think if you stand aside and look at the situation, it's actually the failure to manage traffic. We've allowed cars and we've allowed traffic to dictate how our cities function or not function. And over the last 70 years, we've gone from having quiet, clean air cities and clean air streets to having cities that are dominated by private cars, congested by cars, and it is impossible to run good quality, high frequency bus operations in that environment. We all know what happens is that buses get slower, the costs get higher, passengers go away, you put the fares up to try and keep things sustainable, and you go into a spiral of decline. And the easiest way to break that spiral of decline is to manage the traffic. So I think that's fundamental. And I try to avoid the kind of situation where we end up going native. And producing bus service improvement plans as if the bus services were the problem. It's well worth producing those plans, but we shouldn't forget the fact the big issue that will make a difference is if we deal with traffic, manage the streets and clear the streets. Until we do that, we have no real future.
I suspect, Robert, that there are a few people on this call today who would disagree with the fundamental point you're making there. The challenge has always been to me, how on earth do you get politicians who are notoriously fickle and do not like voting for like turkeys for Christmas? Do not they assume that anything which is damaging to the motorist is likely to be damaging to their electoral chances, and it's not a one party against another party. It seems to me that generally politicians across the board suffer from this difficulty, that as soon as you put to them a proposition such as you're suggesting here, they run a mile. How do you think we can possibly get them to engage with this? Because I think you make an interesting point about the whole sort of approach to franchising is it's a solution that people think, we could have one of those because that looks like it works. But actually, how do you get them to address the real problem?
I agree entirely with you, James, in that context. The toughest thing is how we actually get not just politicians, but the population as a whole to accept that we are all traffic. In the sense that cars are a very good thing if only 10% of the population have them. If 90% of the population have them, they are a very bad thing. And the adage that you actually, when someone complains about traffic, you have to remind them, well, you're part of the traffic, you're part of the cause. Bear in mind that the success in London of franchising in the 1990s was underpinned by the congestion charge. And therefore TfL and Ken Livingstone were brave enough to actually do the very thing you've said, that we might not want to take that risk. But it was only by taking that risk and making that challenge that the difference was made. And I remember in the mid-2000s, early 2000s, Manchester was on the way to following. They were consulting on a congestion charge. And in fact, I was at Stagecoach at the time when we actually replaced the entire Manchester bus fleet in anticipation of that happening. That was the private sector contribution to it, was to say, well, you do that, we'll invest in buses. And 3/4 of the way through the process, they got cold feet. And I can understand why they got cold feet. But if we are saying that London is the model, then London's model is based on a congestion charge. You can't drive freely in London. And therefore, that's a message there. You've also got to look at another powerful message, which is that if we are to deal with climate change and to achieve the climate change targets that we as a country have opted into as part of the world, we cannot achieve those targets without cutting the level of traffic in cities massively. If we don't do that, we'll not get there. And ultimately, if we don't do that, we won't have a planet. So I think we've actually got to move the narrative. And I think we have to move it into a situation where it's why I made the point about drink driving and all the rest of it. I mean, you have to move the narrative to the point where we have to deal with traffic. It's not about buses, it's about traffic. And if we deal with traffic, the corollary of that is it becomes easier to develop bus use and grow bus use. And Roger's point is perfectly valid. We need to make sure the industry manages it well.
I mean, it is interesting. I don't want to kind of dominate the whole conversation with this, but it is interesting that if you don't have local management who can make the case to their local politicians, I don't see how this is ever going to work on a national basis, because it must be done, as you say, it's a local thing in the first hand, and we need people to be able to explain all that to the politicians and try and recruit them on board. So I think there's some dangerous trends around. Anyway, we must move on. Matt Gamble says, interesting comment on how reducing congestion can enable better bus services and mode shift. Totally agree. Your views then, Robert, on who specifies and funds bus service improvements in the short term to deal with the lag between, say, introducing a congestion charge and increased demand for bus services?
I think at the end of the day, whatever you do, whether you franchise or whether you do it in a global partnership, you will have to have funding in the short term. I don't think that it would be difficult to persuade significant private sector operators to actually put their money where their mouth is if you're in a situation where you are going to create a genuine, benevolent bus operating environment. I think there's an understanding in the investment community right now that investment in public transport is a sensible thing to do. That's one of the reasons we're seeing bids for the PLCs by external financial bodies, because there is a very good financial case for investment in zero emission, investment in priority, investment in quality, as long as it's paralleled by political action on air quality and congestion and the environment. And there's a very strong message in there. And I think we're at a crossroads where we can actually move in a different direction. And
do you think that these new external owners are actually going to engage sufficiently to want to do this, or are they just in it for a short-term profit?
How do you make a profit if you haven't got a growing market? I mean, the issue there is very much one about growth. And there are two ways of doing it. You could simply take the view that you'll cooperate with the whole franchising process and expect to make a profit through public sector cash. We've seen the public sector debt trends. That's not going to last. And there's a very strange situation at the moment where the DfT are encouraging Manchester to proceed with the franchising proposal at the same time as they're refusing to pay TfL the cost of delivering a bus network in London. There's a complete dichotomy there. And that simply has to shift, and it makes absolutely no sense to move the cost of supplying urban mobility in the big cities of the UK onto the public sector balance sheet. Why would you do that? When if you clear the traffic situation, you can create a benevolent environment that generates growth, and that then becomes self-funding, self-perpetuating. We've dug ourselves into a hole as the traffic growth has increased, that bus services have got weaker and weaker and weaker. We've actually got to reverse that. How do we finance that in the short term? It would make more sense from the public sector point of view to put money into capital schemes and money into congestion schemes in order to create a financially sustainable business, rather than having something that depends on subsidy forever.
Interesting. Now, Robert Jack is editor of Passenger Transport, so you'd expect him to have an of the moment question. He says, we've just witnessed the resignation of a Prime Minister who professed to love buses and indeed launched the first ever national bus strategy for England, and even wrote the foreword himself. How would you rate Boris Johnson's legacy in regard to buses, and how hopeful are you that buses will remain as high on the agenda of the next occupant of 10 Downing Street?
I think on the plus side, it's fair to say that we have a national bus strategy. We have a foreword, we have a document. But I don't think we've gone much further than the document, because the original bus strategy was to be supported by £5 billion of government money, which then magically dwindled to about 1.4. Now, I think we've got a bus strategy in terms of the thought is there and the idea is there, but whether we have funded it sufficiently and we're committed strongly enough to it is a different question. And it's also a flawed bus strategy in that it is too focused on buses. It still leaves buses battling against traffic, and that's almost a mountain to climb. What you really need to do is take that traffic problem away and let buses perform. Now, whether we'll get a new Prime Minister who will even notice that buses exist is debatable. That could very well happen.
Most don't.
You know, We've seen 16 billion pounds spent on the rail industry during the pandemic. And if you were to invest £10 billion into the UK bus industry, you would transform it. So it's there to be done. And it's up to the industry and to anybody who cares about the environment in our cities to begin to make the case for it. But we really do need to focus not on the bus operations themselves, but creating the environment in the first place. So you have to clear the traffic.
Yes, it seems to me that it keeps coming back to the politicians, and it's interesting that I suppose there are people who might say that having Boris as your friend is probably not your best asset, but it does seem to me that the difficulty here is that that to swing the agenda across to dealing with the problem of just the clogged traffic and the enormous growth. It's just gone on growing and growing and growing all my lifetime. It's just been growing inexorably, and we now have congestion in places just because at any time of day, in any given location, there's too many people trying to do the same thing, and the whole thing collapses. And yet the politicians are focusing still on the thought that they don't have control over which bus goes where and how the public transport works, and that's actually what's motivating their desire to stop people like you and me and our younger colleagues from actually doing. So it seems to me that remains the fundamental problem.
I think it's an important part of the kind of partnership I'm talking about. But the politicians would have significant influence in that. I mean, that's the whole point, is that buses have always sat in this world where they are a business, but they're also a very political animal and an important part of the community. And I don't think you can run buses in a major city without hand in glove cooperation between the politicians and the operator. And we've seen that work in various places. And that's the only way forward. I think the idea, I'm not in any way advocating that we keep things the way they are or the way they've been. I think I'm simply advocating a different way of looking at the change. And those ideas that are in that presentation that I've made today were actually the thoughts that went through my mind post the Nexus inquiry. And when we had discussions with Nexus at the time, it was a case of simply thinking, how do we bring both sides together on this? How do we find a common cause and find a way in which we can use the powers of the local authority and the government alongside the innovation and the investment and the marketing and delivery expertise of the private sector? How do we find a way in which we can work together? And so I see it as being not the past, this is a new future, and we find a new way of doing things. And I don't see adopting the London style franchising as a new way of doing things. I don't think across the country that the money is there to fund it. And I'm not entirely convinced that it'll deliver enough creativity, for example. Having looked at what's likely to happen in Manchester, it's not going to be exciting. It's not going to carry some of the things that I've seen some bus operators do very, very well. You've seen a lot of innovation in some parts of the bus industry. There will not be that degree of innovation in a franchise network. And TfL, for all the good work they have done, were never at the cutting edge of marketing bus services. They did a lot of very good things. In fact, they dealt with the traffic issue far better. But you do need to get that combination. And I don't think it's a good thing for the bus industry, for the politicians to feel alienated, as if, buses are an important part of our city. We don't have any influence. They have to have influence. Yeah. You need to be able to sit down and discuss it.
So do you think that the new ways of ownership and managing the commercial bus groups actually might find that the thought of franchising is rather comforting actually? Let's settle for some kind of fixed margin somewhere and leave all these problems to somebody else to solve, and all we do is just trundle out the buses as per the PVR and do what somebody else tells us to do. Don't you feel that's actually quite an attractive proposition to beleaguered owners?
Yeah, see, let's say I take my bus operator hat off and decide I'm just a citizen of a city in the UK, I would see that as being a very sad outcome, because what you've got is the ability to develop bus operations, to develop services, do innovative marketing, innovative network design, a lot of things that we've shown, we've seen different operators across the UK do positively. You need to harness that, and also harness bringing the politicians on side as to where you want to go. And one of the big issues in this is, for example, if there's an issue with the network, if politically there's a view the network's wrong, and it's not underpinning the economic development of the city, there's a need for the operators and the politicians and the planners to sit in one room and actually pull that problem apart and understand exactly what is it that's missing, how do we get to where we're going to go, and what's the way forward. And I think there is a genuine problem there, that we haven't seen enough good partnerships working. I remember sitting in a meeting in Oxford after you'd left, James, with Oxfordshire County Council and South Yorkshire Passenger Transport Executive in the one room discussing partnership, and we were showing what had happened in Oxford and how Oxford worked. And it was almost like talking a foreign language, because the County Council's view was very much one of, we create the environment, we deal with some of the traffic issues, we create a positive environment, and we let the operators get on with delivering the service. And that message wasn't really getting across. There was a veer of, yeah, how could we do that? But we control it. You know, so I think you've actually got to learn how to make those kind of partnerships work.
Yeah.
And if you get the balance right, you don't want anyone leaving the room aggrieved. You want everyone leaving the room understanding what we're doing and why we're doing it. And that can be achieved. And the world is changing so much that the development of mobility as a service, development of apps and e-scooters and all the other stuff actually means that this is no longer a bus issue, it's a mobility issue. Buses are just part of it. And the obsession that we have special legislation for buses, as opposed to legislation for mobility in cities, is at the heart of the problem.
Very interesting. Peter Shelley wants you to come up with the key to this. I think, as you say, he says people don't see their own car use as part of the problem, and any restrictions are seen negatively. And how on earth do we change that outlook? Seems to me that's a fundamental question.
That's probably, I mean, again, it's another problem that's similar to the drink driving issue and the smoking in public places issue. That we have got to think creatively about how we can persuade people that they are the problem. And there are things which you are doing at the moment, which are a habit that you've got to kick. And it's a very two-edged sword, because you have this argument that says, well, if bus services were better, I wouldn't use the car. The bus services can't be better because you are using your car. So we do need to think creatively about how we carry people with us. And if we go back to the political issue of the day, having a prime minister who loves buses is a good thing if you're in the bus industry. Actually, what we need is a prime minister who loves free mobility in cities, a prime minister who loves clean air and traffic-free streets, and people are able to do the travel they want, make the mobility they want, using mass transit conveniently and simply. And that's really what we would, I mean, if we could choose a prime minister from here on, that's what we want, is someone who sees that radical change on city environments. And the biggest key to it is reducing the need or dependence on individual private cars. And as part of that wider issue, buses are part of it. They're not the beginning of it, they're not the end of it, but it is part of the problem. But if you try to focus everybody on thinking the only problem with mobility in Leeds and Manchester and Bradford and Birmingham is buses, that simply is not true.
So you're very well placed with your international experience to answer this last question, I guess. which is that this feels like a bit of a British problem. Is that fair? When I go abroad, I haven't been abroad much since 2020, since 2019, but my sense is that there are cities just across the channel where the politicians have got to grips with this or are getting to grips with it in a quite different way from what we're doing. Is that your sense?
I think it's definitely a sense worldwide. There's a greater realization that traffic is a bad thing, and that you can find better ways of getting mobility in cities, whether that's by improving bus services or changing the planning regulations so that people don't have to travel so much. There are things that you can do, and there's certainly a worldwide understanding that you cannot simply leave car traffic unbridled. I mean, even I do quite a bit of work in the Middle East, and even in the Middle East, in the oil capitals of the world, the amount of investment and focus on public transport in cities is huge. And they are all committed to doing something radical and dramatic about that. If you take Qatar, for example, and Qatar are in the process of acquiring over 1,000 zero-emission buses in the short term for the World Cup. But they will all then be redeployed into an expanded bus network when the World Cup is over. So you're seeing a lot of movement of that sort. And we're not seeing anything near as imaginative as that in any of our cities. When you look at what's happening in Manchester, the big thing in Manchester is moving to franchise contracts and giving the politicians their buses back. To do what? What's the benefit of that? That's a change of ownership issue. It's not a change of quality of service. It's not a change of quality of environment. And there's a bigger picture here. And what we really need is to address that mobility picture in big cities. And I say buses are part of it. They're part of the solution. I don't think they are the problem. They are the victims of a problem, a traffic problem. Not entirely innocent, because some of the comments that Roger made earlier, I can think of examples. I mean, I look at some operators at some points to think, what on earth are you doing that for? So it does apply, but it's not the big problem.
Yeah, and that brings you back to where you started, and that's a super point at which to draw stumps today. And I think, Robert, what you've done is to get us thinking in some ways quite a depressing scenario, but if only we can get engagement in this debate with our politicians, then it seems to me we've got to drive people to think about the key issue which you've brought to light today, which is that the problem is the traffic, and unless you solve that, you solve nothing. So thank you, Robert, so much for bringing our series to a conclusion with this session. I think it's been most interesting, and I'd be interested to see what people make of it watching it on the recording. So thanks to you. Thanks also to our audience, of course, for your interest in the various comments and questions. Don't forget that the program has been recorded and will in due course be uploaded to YouTube, probably tomorrow morning. You'll be able to access it and all the previous 6 lunchtime masterclasses by going to Passenger Transport's website. Indeed, I must thank our media partners, Rob Jack and Andrew Garnett at Passenger Transport, who are reporting on these sessions as they unfold. I'm also grateful to Ray Stenning at Best Impressions, who produced our super advert in the magazine, and to Atkins, of course, for supporting the whole thing financially. I should also mention my BRT UK colleagues, Patrick Warner and John Carr, as well as the other BRT UK board members who've been working behind the scenes to ensure the success of this program of lunchtime masterclasses supported by Atkins. If you want a copy of the slides, Bob has made a PDF of them available, so simply email me at events@brtuk.com and I'll send you a copy. Before we go, I should mention an event at which I'm speaking next week. It's the Quality Bus a Solutions Showcase Conference being held in person at the Transport Museum in Coventry next Tuesday and Wednesday, 12th and 13th of July. 2022, say the organisers, will be the test of the UK's grand plan to bus back better. I'll say, meet the pioneers who are making this happen, they invite. As we heard when we had an earlier masterclass, Coventry and the wider West Midlands is, in addition to Sprint that we heard about, a hotbed of bus innovations. So Landor Links is inviting you, therefore, to join these innovation leaders and various other people, including somebody from BRT UK, that's me, and the experts around the new products and services that are transforming the bus and passenger experience. So there are a few supported places available for BRT UK members. If you're interested, I can send you the link. Places are limited and it's next week, so you'll have to get on with that. Okay, anyway, back to today and to a super session. Thanks to Robert for that. This is the conclusion of the second series of 7 lunchtime masterclasses supported by Atkins. So with a very big thank you again, therefore, to today's special guest and speaker, Robert Montgomery, and indeed to all of you for joining us today. This is James Freeman signing off for BRT UK. Goodbye.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Bye.